The screen opens in darkness as raindrops ripple across a black puddle. A faded photograph of a cute 7-year-old blonde girl flutters into the water as Aileen Wuornos's voice begins telling her story. She always wanted to be in the movies, dreaming that one day she'd be a big star, cameras following her around, capturing what nobody else could see. We see young Aileen playing dress-up in her mother's clothes, preening like a movie star, pretending to smoke and laugh as if chatting with friends. She plays with dolls on a cardboard box stage, making them dance and kiss before flying them around like they're driving away to a better life. But when we get a close-up of young Aileen, we see she has a black eye and lacerations on her neck, though she still grins with innocent pleasure. The scene shifts to Aileen's bedroom at night. She's lying in bed, frightened, holding her covers tight as her eyes dart nervously before clenching shut in dread. The bedroom door slowly opens, suggesting something sinister. Years pass and we see teenage Aileen, dirty and unstylishly dressed, approaching a group of girls at a bus stop. They glare and laugh at her soundlessly, turning her smile into a hardened scowl. Aileen's voiceover explains that these people just didn't know who she was going to become, but one day they would. Behind a garage, teenage Aileen stands provocatively dressed and made up as teenage boys crowd around her. She takes $1 and lifts her blouse, gazing wistfully at a cute boy. But when he stares at her chest and meets her gaze with a sneer, her face instantly contorts into an indifferent glare. She tucks the $1 away, already learning that men will disappoint her. In an alley at night, teenage Aileen gets into a car with a 50-year-old man who smiles at her lecherously. Later, in a different car, with a handsome man in his 20s, she swoons as he kisses her neck, believing he might be the one to take her away to a new life where everything would be different. But that fantasy crumbles when we see 18-year-old Aileen in a shabby living room with the young man and his disapproving mother clearly arguing about her. Outside in a parking lot, the couple fights violently until he throws her to the ground and drives away, leaving her sobbing and screaming in the dirt. Aileen's voiceover explains that she lived in her head for a long time, dreaming of better things, and it was nice. But one day, it just stopped. The deafening sound of rain fills the scene as we see worn, red eyes holding a cold stare. 30-year-old Aileen, now calling herself Lee, sits under a highway underpass in the pouring Florida rain. She's dirty and disheveled, staring at a .22 handgun in her lap while clutching a crumpled $5 bill. The contents of her purse are spilled in the muddy water around her. After a deep breath, she stands and walks to the highway, sticking out her thumb to hitchhike. Lee's voiceover explains that by the time she met Selby Wall, all she wanted was a beer. The scene transitions to the Zodiac Bar in Daytona Beach, where 26-year-old Selby Wall sits alone, sipping a Jack and Coke. She's chubby and nondescript, but has a soft attractiveness despite her masculine attire. Her right wrist is in a cast. Selby watches other patrons having fun at crowded tables while she sits alone. When a girl at another table needs a chair, Selby eagerly offers hers, only to watch the girl take it back to her friends, leaving Selby even more isolated. The door chime sounds as Lee enters, shaking off the rain. Despite her soaked and dirty clothes that announce her profession, she's striking with wild blonde hair and hardened good look that are both frightening and compelling. The crowd turns to stare, and Selby is immediately mesmerized, nearly dropping her drink. Lee pushes through to the bar and asks for a towel, but the bartender rudely tells her services are for patrons only. Lee angrily throws down her $5 bill, demanding a beer and asking if this is a gay place. When the bartender confirms it is, Lee shrugs and says whatever, tossing back her beer. Selby, gathering courage, approaches the jukebox behind Lee and pretends to look at song selections while stealing nervous glances. She punches in numbers for Patsy Cline and awkwardly tries to start a conversation, offering to buy Lee a drink. Lee initially rebuffs her, saying she has money, but Selby persists, ordering a pitcher and asking if Lee comes here often. When Lee asks for a tissue, Selby eagerly provides napkins. As Lee cleans her face, gay male couples stare smugly, prompting Lee to aggressively ask if they have a problem. This delights Selby, who compliments Lee's beauty, but Lee quickly recoils, insisting she's not gay. Selby admits that most girls won't talk to her and asks what Lee does for work. Lee claims she has a pressure cleaning business and is just getting out of the rain. When Lee gets up to leave, dismissing Selby as a fat fucking dyke who won't get anything for a beer, Selby finds her courage and grabs Lee's arm. Selby angrily tells Lee she wasn't trying to sleep with her. She knows Lee won't. She just wanted someone to talk to before heading back to her parents' closet. She explains she was trying to have one decent night out, talking to the best-looking girl in the place, and as the lesbian, she doesn't see how that's a waste of time. Lee's intense stare bores through Selby, but something in Selby's honest desperation makes her sit back down. Lee admits she was just trying to be straight with her, and they both stare awkwardly at the pitcher of beer. Hours later, the bar has emptied, and Lee and Selby are drunk and happy, throwing back shots at the bar. Lee wins every drinking contest while Selby struggles to keep up. When the bartender announces closing time, Lee curses him out, calling him a stick-in-the-ass pansy, making Selby burst into laughter as they stumble out together. Outside, Lee howls into the night before sobering slightly. She thanks Selby for the drinks and apologizes for calling her a fat dyke, saying she's fun and pretty and was just being mean. When it becomes obvious Lee has nowhere to go, Selby nervously invites her to stay, quickly clarifying she doesn't have to do anything. At Selby's aunt's suburban house, Lee follows like a dog who's never been inside before, amazed by the middle-class surroundings. They pass through a kitchen and garage to reach Selby's makeshift bedroom, filled with boxes around a bed, lined with stuffed animals, and dominated by a large cross. After Lee showers and changes into Selby's oversized pajamas, they climb into bed together. Selby asks if she can touch Lee's face, and when Lee agrees, Selby's fingers gently skim down her cheek, calling her pretty. Selby's head sinks near Lee's shoulder as her hand grasps the pajama fabric. Lee's eyes open vulnerable, then slip shut as she absorbs this unexpected affection. Lee's voiceover explains she's always moved too fast in love, but after spending the day in the rain about to kill herself, she wasn't feeling particularly cautious. She mentions that hookers had been showing up dead on Florida highways, and when she found herself hoping someone would just end it all for her, she knew she had nothing left to lose. The next morning, Selby's conservative Aunt Debbie discovers Lee in bed with Selby and is horrified, ordering them to leave through the back door. Outside, Lee and Selby make plans to meet later at the Moonlight roller rink, with Lee promising to swing by around 5. Inside the house, Debbie angrily prepares for church with her husband Randy and teenage son Trevor. The family dynamic is tense, with Randy's angry demeanor dominating the household as they rush to leave for church. Meanwhile, Lee sneaks into a storage facility where she's been living illegally. Rita, the overweight owner, catches her and threatens to throw out her belongings for non-payment. Thomas, a disabled veteran in fatigues, intervenes with beer and a sandwich for Lee. When she offers to perform oral sex for payment, he sadly declines, asking how she's doing instead. Lee excitedly tells Thomas she met someone, and when he warns her to be careful, she insists this is different. Thomas, wearing a POW MIA shirt, shouts at imaginary CIA surveillance in the bushes, revealing his paranoid mental state from the war. At a gas station bathroom, Lee washes and prepares herself carefully, blow-drying her hair and applying makeup in the filthy mirror, transforming herself for her date with Selby. That evening at the Moonlight roller disco, Selby anxiously scans the crowd until she spots Lee arguing with the man at the turnstile. Selby pays Lee's admission, and they both clearly took great care with their appearance. Lee in masculine clothing, Selby trying to look tough. Over nachos and cokes, Selby asks if Lee is a prostitute. When Lee confirms this, Selby is awed rather than disgusted, fascinated that people pay to be with her. Lee, enjoying this glorifying perspective, cockily explains how easy men are to read, pointing out different men in the rink and describing their sexual preferences with confidence. When Selby asks about her cousin Trevor, Lee incorrectly identifies him as gay, making them both laugh. Selby explains her situation. Her parents disowned her after a girl from church told them Selby tried to kiss her. She came to Florida to figure herself out, but broke her arm before finding work, so she made a deal with her father to return home. Lee tells Selby her soul seems pretty good, and they both know their time together is limited. To make the most of it, Lee pulls Selby onto the skating floor, despite her protests about not being able to skate. Lee is an excellent skater and keeps Selby upright as they glide around the rink. When the DJ announces a couples-only skate to Journey's Don't Stop Believing, Lee flips backward and insists they stay on the floor. With Lee skating backward and guiding Selby, their hands clasp as Lee tells Selby to just look at her and sense the other skaters rather than watch for them. In this moment of trust and connection, Lee puts her hand on Selby's neck and pulls her into a kiss. Selby's eyes flutter with emotion, then dart open in fear, but Lee won't let go. When they finally part, Lee has a wondrous smile, and despite the stares from other skaters, Selby doesn't care. Their hands remain clasped as Lee asks if Selby wants to get out of there. In an alley outside, They fall against a concrete wall, kissing desperately. Lee's skilled hands bring Selby to climax against the wall, leaving her amazed by the sexual experience. Afterward, sitting together, Lee examines Selby's small hands, noting no one has really held them before. When Selby mentions that some big guy might hold them someday, she laughs, saying she doubts men would like her, even if she liked them. Lee asks if Selby likes her, and when Selby incredulously confirms she does, Lee reveals her vulnerability like a frightened puppy looking for affection. Selby asks if Lee really likes her, and Lee admits she doesn't really like anyone, but she likes Selby. When Selby notes it figures the only girl who's ever liked her shows up now when she has to leave, Lee suggests they make the most of tomorrow and take Selby out grand. The next morning, Lee hitchhikes on a rural highway, studying each passing car before flagging down a green Monte Carlo driven by Chuck, a well-dressed man in his 50s. Lee switches to her helpless female persona, showing him a photo of two blonde children she claims are hers, explaining she needs to get to Miami but is broke and trying to make money somehow. Meanwhile, Selby packs her suitcase at her aunt's house, finding a religious pamphlet asking, "Can homosexuals change?" We did. She tosses it aside and continues packing, preparing for an evening with Lee. That evening, Lee walks quickly down the highway, counting disappointing earnings, when a brown Grand Prix slows behind her. Richard Mallory, in his late 40s with a thick mustache and baseball hat, grins from behind the wheel and offers her a ride. After checking the time, Lee agrees to a quick ride. In Mallory's car, he drives onto a wooded path, while Lee anxiously asks him not to go too far. He wants privacy to avoid getting busted and offers her liquor from a flask. When Lee proposes $20 for oral sex, he insists he wants to have intercourse for $30. He parks and produces the money, but won't hand it over until after, placing it in the ashtray. As Lee starts to undress, Mallory's easygoing manner becomes sinister. He tells her to slow down, drinking and making disturbing comments about loving and hating hookers. When Lee tries to proceed, he becomes violent, grabbing a pipe and striking her unconscious. Lee awakens to find herself being sexually assaulted while partially hanging out of the driver's side door. Mallory laughs sadistically, using the pipe, rubbing alcohol on her wounds while she screams. He kicks her repeatedly and prepares to rape her, but Lee manages to free one hand and grab her gun from her bag. The gun explodes with a deafening crack, hitting Mallory in the chest. Lee frees her other hand and stands in the doorway, firing repeatedly as Mallory stumbles backward. She follows him as he falls, screaming "motherfucker" with each shot. Even when Mallory's clearly dying, she leans down for a point-blank shot that destroys his neck. Standing over the corpse, Lee first feels calm curiosity, then explodes in fury, kicking and punching the lifeless body while screaming about him dying in hell. She eventually calms and begins cleaning up, dragging Mallory's body and rolling it in carpeting into a shallow ravine. In the trunk, she finds rope, tape, and clothing intended for the same purpose she experienced. Realizing Mallory planned this assault, she laughs grimly, telling the corpse, "I win, motherfucker," before changing into an electrician's bodysuit from his supplies. Lee drives Mallory's car slowly down a rural highway, throwing out evidence while keeping anything useful. At a gas station bathroom, she cleans herself up, applies makeup, and practices controlled breathing like an athlete preparing for competition. Late that night, Lee appears at Selby's bedroom window, startling her awake. When Selby gestures frantically for her to leave due to footsteps upstairs, Lee hides as Randy appears with a gun, investigating the noise. Debbie confronts Selby suspiciously, making it clear she needs to leave soon. Outside, Lee explains to Selby that she got in a fight and is wearing weird clothes, but she's been thinking they shouldn't let their time together end. She produces a wad of money, suggesting they rent a hotel and hang out instead of Selby leaving. When Selby asks where she got the money, Lee claims she's good at earning it. Lee pressures Selby with an ultimatum: come with her now or never see her again, claiming Selby may never meet someone like her again. Despite the risk, Selby agrees, abandoning her planned return home to go with Lee. Lee's voiceover reveals that between Selby heading back to a miserable life and Lee probably getting caught eventually anyway, she figured the least she could do was finance them some joy with Mallory's money. At a Kmart, Lee buys masculine clothing for herself, joking about going dyke. They check into the cheap Fairview Motor Lodge, where Selby marvels at their queen-sized bed like it's the Taj Mahal. The couple goes shopping for supplies and visits a barber shop where Selby gets a slightly bolder haircut, while Lee tends to a head wound in the bathroom. That night, at the Last Resort, a densely packed biker bar, Lee proudly escorts Selby through the crowd. Lee introduces Selby to Cubby, the bouncer, asking him to look out for her. At the bar, bar, they drink heavily and throw back shots, with Lee easily out-drinking Selby. Lee's voiceover explains she felt like part of something for the first time, a couple like those she'd always watched from afar. No matter how tired or worried she got, she felt truly alive. They belonged in this rough crowd, smiling proudly despite their bad teeth and unconventional appearance. Back in their motel room, they lie in each other's arms, drunk and happy. Lee grips tightly to Selby's chest, while Selby kisses her face gently. Lee's voiceover notes that the funny thing about good things in life is once you get a taste, they're never enough. The next day, Lee cleans Mallory's car meticulously with Windex and paper towels at a swamp, preparing to abandon it. Meanwhile, Selby goes through Lee's belongings, finding money in a shoebox. She takes a cab to retrieve her suitcase from her aunt's house, where Debbie confronts her. When Selby's father calls, Debbie forces her to take it. Her father angrily demands she return home, calling her a filthy liar about her dirty little lesbian visitors. Selby defiantly tells him she's staying with someone who makes more money than he does, and that she's an adult, making her own choices. She hangs up on him and leaves with her suitcase. In the woods, Lee burns the electrician's bodysuit while reflecting on her situation. Her voiceover explains that everyone has faith in something, and all she'd had left was love. But when her boyfriend stole her pressure cleaning equipment, something finally broke. She mentions the story about quitting prostitution was partly true. She had spent 2 years saving for that equipment. Back at the motel, Lee returns to find Selby with her suitcase, announcing she's staying. Lee is overjoyed, grabbing Selby in a hug. She announces she's quitting prostitution to clean up her life, claiming she has everything going for her now that she has Selby. When Selby says she doesn't mind Lee continuing sex work since it's good money, Lee insists she'll get a regular job and career instead. They toast their decision with beer, as Lee explains her philosophy about life and love. Lee's voiceover recalls a saying from when she was 13 and had just put a baby up for adoption. At a school assembly, a drummer from Slim Whitman's band spoke about success, saying all you need in life is love and believing in yourself, and then there's nothing you can't do. This advice stuck with her, though she now realizes it was better to hear a flat-out lie than know the truth at 13. Lee begins job hunting, visiting various offices in an ill-fitting suit with a dirty briefcase. At a legal office, a lawyer becomes increasingly irritated as Lee explains she has no experience, resume, or mali, workiskas, ori, tari, or kari, kali, college, or degree, but wants to be a secretary. He insults her, suggesting she thinks the party's over and she can suddenly get what people work their entire lives for. Lee angrily curses him and throws files around as she storms out. That night, at the last resort, Lee holds court at the bar, slightly drunk, and telling Selby about throwing the lawyer's files around and telling him to fuck himself. She develops an increasingly manic philosophy about men being fundamentally flawed, whether in business, politics, or personal relationships. When Selby points out they're broke, Lee insists she has connections and things lined up. Selby mentions the motel manager threatening eviction, but Lee dismisses her concerns. At an employment office, Lee desperately explains her situation to a black woman who, unmoved, offers only minimum wage factory work. When told there are no openings, Lee kicks the desk in frustration. Meanwhile, Selby shoplifts candy bars at a drugstore due to hunger. A young employee named Justine catches her but lies to the manager, claiming Selby bought the items earlier and wants to exchange them. Outside, Selby eats her stolen candy bar, humiliated by her situation. Lee panhandles on the street, fighting her pride as people pass her with sideways glances. When a man gives her change, she forces a smile but clenches her teeth with hatred. A police car approaches and stops beside her, with the cop asking her to come with him due to complaints. In the patrol car, Lee recognizes the cop who arrested her 8 months earlier and went easy on her, though she remembers him nearly breaking her jaw. He suggests she owes him one and indicates he wants sexual favors. In an underground parking garage, Lee performs oral sex on him before he drives away with a cruel smile. Reading a newspaper, Lee finds an article about Richard Mallory's body being discovered, but police having no leads, suggesting it was drug-related robbery. This news relieves her temporarily. That evening, Lee bursts into their motel room with manic energy, telling Selby she's giving up on finding legitimate work. She announces she's going back to prostitution, having accepted that traditional employment isn't possible for someone with her background. Selby explodes in anger, throwing a lamp at Lee and accusing her of making her stay to starve. In the ensuing fight, Lee reveals she killed someone the night she stood Selby up. She explains she was raped and beaten and was going to be killed, but all she could think about was how Selby would never know she meant to show up and would think Lee stood her up forever. Lee sobs as she describes killing Mallory to save her own life, explaining she couldn't stand to die knowing Selby could have loved her. When Selby tries to leave, Lee desperately grabs her suitcase, but Selby eventually returns and comforts the crying Lee. Lee shows Selby the newspaper article about Mallory, and Selby is relieved to learn it's over and that he would have killed Lee. The next evening, Lee hitchhikes again, approaching cars with renewed purpose. She gets into a Cadillac with Will, a heavy-set older man who immediately makes crude sexual comments. When he asks if she wants to call him daddy while he fucks her, Lee sarcastically asks if he likes to fuck his kids, horrifying him briefly before she plays along. After he pays $40 and begins undressing, Lee suddenly loses interest in the charade. When Will continues his crude talk and starts masturbating, Lee pulls out her gun and shoots him. She empties the gun into his chest as he convulses, then mockingly calls him a child molester while finding a photo of a young girl in his wallet. Lee returns to the motel with the Cadillac and hundreds of dollars. Selby is initially overjoyed by the money, but becomes suspicious about the car. Lee claims she borrowed it from Thomas, and they can now move to a better place. In the bathroom, Lee washes blood from her naked body as it spirals down the drain. Lee's voiceover reflects on how strange life is and how things can be different than expected. She recalls childhood memories of watching a Ferris wheel at a carnival, dreaming of riding it, and imagining it would feel like flying. But when she finally got the chance years later, she was so nauseous and scared she threw up before it made a full turn. The meaning becomes clear. In her life, harmless things hurt the most, while horrible things she couldn't imagine turned out easier than expected. You never really know until you're standing there facing the situation yourself. Days later, Lee and Selby shop at an outlet store with their newfound wealth. Selby tries on ghetto, lesbian, fabulous outfits, while Lee sits bored in the husband chairs, tracking other customers with knowing looks. At the jewelry counter, when a manager asks Selby's name to personalize a necklace, Lee explodes in paranoid rage, thinking he's being too familiar and threatening him. After Lee storms out, Selby apologetically pays for her purchases. Outside, Lee explains she's trying to protect Selby and they can't be telling people their business. She shows Selby more money and promises to buy her shoes tomorrow, making up after their fight. That evening, Lee picks up Gene, a burly workman who takes her to a wooded area. Expecting him to be violent, Lee is surprised when he nervously reveals he's never done this before and stutters badly. She provides manual sexual services rather than shooting him, taking only $20 and leaving him grateful. Lee continues killing Johns, with her voiceover explaining that all she wanted was a week with Selby, but she figured the least she could do was finance them some joy with her victims' money. They go shopping, get haircuts, and frequent the last resort biker bar where Lee proudly introduces Selby as her girlfriend. At the bar, they drink heavily and throw back shots, while Lee's voiceover explains she felt like part of a couple for the first time, truly alive despite her exhaustion and worries. They belonged in this rough crowd, smiling proudly despite their imperfections. One day, Lee cleans a car thoroughly with supplies, abandoning it in swampland. Meanwhile, Selby gets a job at the drugstore where she previously shoplifted, working with Justine, who had helped her. Selby enjoys the work and camaraderie with her co-workers, feeling normal for the first time. At the photo counter, Selby and Justine bond over family photos and shared experiences. They discover an old photo booth that still works and take pictures together, eventually sharing an innocent kiss. But Lee arrives unexpectedly, finding them in the booth and becoming intensely jealous. Lee intimidates Justine and steals beer from the store, embarrassing Selby at her work. Outside in a red Pontiac she claims to have borrowed, Lee tearfully accuses Selby of wanting another girl and treating her like everyone else treats her. Despite Selby's protests that nothing happened, Lee's insecurity and possessiveness emerge. The next day, while driving to Six Flags as Lee promised, they crash the car into a suburban yard. Lee immediately instructs Selby to run, claiming the man they hit is dead. She cleans the car of evidence and abandons it in the woods, explaining to a traumatized Selby that they have to leave immediately. Back at their apartment, Selby demands Lee admit what she's been doing. Lee reluctantly shows her newspaper clippings of all her victims, explaining they were bad men who deserved to die. She argues that she's cleaning up society by killing rapists and killers, claiming she's doing everyone a favor since nobody cares about these men anyway. Lee presents an increasingly manic philosophy about the war between sexes and her role in protecting women from predatory men. She justifies her actions by claiming self-defense and argues that the world is fundamentally corrupt, killing being necessary for survival. When Selby expresses doubt about whether whether all the victims were bad. Lee insists they were, and shows her the money she's accumulated, claiming it's almost enough to buy pressure cleaning equipment and go legitimate. She promises they can have the good life together if Selby will just trust her. Selby tries to leave, but Lee blocks her way, desperately explaining her childhood sexual abuse and how no one believed her when she reported it. She describes being raped since age 8 by her father's friend Victor Bourne, with her father beating her for reporting it. Lee's pain and desperation are evident as she pleads for Selby's understanding and acceptance. Eventually, Selby returns to Lee, asking how long it will take to finish. Lee promises it will be quick, and they can leave for the keys tomorrow. Selby agrees to stay, no longer caring about right and wrong, just wanting to survive with the person she loves. Lee kills again, this time Evan Bolton, a clean-cut military type who has a gun in his car. During the murder, Lee tells him about her childhood abuse, but when she searches his body afterward, she discovers he was a police officer. This escalates the danger significantly, as cop killings bring much more heat than killing random Johns. At their motel, Lee explains to Selby that she had to kill a cop because he tried to trick her into his car. She can't take his vehicle because police cars have tracking devices. Selby demands Lee get another car immediately, or she's leaving, forcing Lee back out to kill again. At the last resort, Lee meets with Thomas, telling him she's leaving town with Selby. Thomas, grateful for her friendship, shares his philosophy about survival from his Vietnam experience. He explains that sometimes you have to do terrible things to survive, and there's no guilt in doing what circumstances force you to do. While they talk, a news report begins playing on the bar's television, announcing a manhunt for a serial killer believed responsible for 6 highway homicides. The report warns against picking up hitchhikers and describes the suspect as possibly being a hitchhiker or prostitute. Thomas realizes the connection and tries to warn Lee, but she's already left to pick up another victim. On the highway, Lee encounters Humphrey Rohrbach, a genuinely kind older man who offers to help her without expecting sexual services. When her gun accidentally falls from her bag, she's forced to take him hostage. In the woods, Lee struggles with killing Humphrey, who pleads for his life, mentioning his wife and daughter who's having a baby. Despite his obvious innocence and kindness, Lee realizes she can't let him live to identify her. She forces herself to shoot him, then collapses in grief, knowing she's crossed a line by killing a good person. Meanwhile, Selby watches news reports showing police sketches of both women. Realizing they're being hunted, she packs her bags and prepares to leave. When Lee returns with Humphrey's car, Selby tells her about the sketches and announces she's not going anywhere. Selby explains she's returning to God and doesn't want to be part of Lee's crimes anymore. Lee desperately argues that they talked about this and that killing was necessary for survival, but Selby maintains that Lee chose violence over faith. In a final confrontation, Lee screams about God's absence during her childhood abuse and rape, arguing that she never had choices in life except Lee and death. When Selby insists on leaving, Lee tells her there's nowhere to go because Lee is her home and she needs her. Selby runs to the drugstore seeking help from Justine, but Justine coldly rejects her, afraid of being associated with whatever Selby is involved in. She fires Selby and tells her not to return, leaving Selby completely isolated. Wandering the dangerous streets alone, Selby realizes she has no one else and returns to Lee. She asks how long finishing will take, and Lee promises they're almost done and can leave tomorrow. Selby agrees to stay, no longer caring about morality, just wanting to survive with someone who loves her. Lee continues killing, becoming more efficient and cold-blooded with each murder. Her voiceover explains her philosophy about justice and survival, comparing her situation to a Ferris wheel that looked magical from a distance, but proved disappointing up close. At the last resort, Thomas recognizes Lee from the news reports and tries to warn her to run, but she's too drunk and heartbroken over Selby to listen. The police, tipped off by various witnesses, surround the bar and arrest Lee as she stumbles outside. In jail, Lee calls Selby, not knowing the call is being recorded by police as part of their investigation. Selby, surrounded by officers and recording equipment, participates in getting Lee to confess on tape. During their final phone conversation, Lee admits to everything to protect Selby, insisting it was only her, and she'll tell them everything so Selby won't go down for it. She expresses her love for Selby one last time, knowing she'll never see her again and that she's going to die. The taped conversation plays in court while Lee sits at the defense table, tears streaming down her face. Selby testifies from the witness stand, avoiding Lee's devastated gaze. Lee tells Selby she forgives her and will always love her, even after death. In her final voiceover, Lee reflects on common sayings about love conquering all and everything happening for a reason, laughing bitterly at these empty platitudes. The film ends with Lee alone in her prison cell, waiting to die, as the music swells with themes of love and loss. The story concludes with Lee's acceptance of her fate, having sacrificed everything for a brief taste of genuine love with Selby, only to lose it all to the violence that had defined her life since childhood. Her journey from abused child to serial killer to death row inmate represents the tragic consequences of a society failed to protect its most vulnerable members.